Welcome back to Pat Psychology Masters. Today I'm going to be talking about something that is very dear to me and something that I think is very useful for people to engage in. So it's a very special episode. I'm going to be talking about expressive writing. So I'll give you a bit of a backstory into why I'm going to talk about expressive writing and how I came across it. Years ago, I struggled very badly with my emotional well-being. Basically, I had a very, very difficult time, particularly around the age of 20, and I had what a lot of people would refer to as a mental breakdown, but it doesn't need a label. I just was particularly unwell at the time, and in about a year after that event, I was kind of harbouring some trauma from it, and it was quite distressing, and I thought that it would be useful for me to write about my experience. And it was. I found it very beneficial from a subjective point of view. I found that it really helped me, and I actually published what I wrote about my experience for everybody to read, to try and put my money where my mouth was in terms of this philosophy I've been talking about for years of having nothing to hide. And that's a story for another day. But basically, I found writing very, very helpful. And I was asking myself, geez, I wonder, is there any kind of scientific research done on writing and how it might be able to help people emotionally? And it turns out there is, and that research is extensive. The practice can be called expressive writing, and it was kind of most formally studied by a very brilliant researcher called James W Pennebaker, and he conducted the first ever expressive writing study in 1988. Now, obviously, expressive writing has been done for millennia. People have been writing in diaries, people have been writing novels and talking about their emotional worlds and about their struggles and about their joys for a long, long time before James Pennebaker ever conducted his first study. I'll just tell you a little bit about this study. He had this hunch, much like I did, that people who suffered traumas would benefit from writing about them. So with this in mind, he got his intro to psychology students, so his first year students. He was a psychology professor at the time. He remains a psychology professor today. He got two groups. He got one group to write expressively, and he gave them very specific instructions, like write about an extremely important emotional issue. Really open up in your writing. You might relate your writing to different events in your life or different relationships. I want you to write for 15 minutes and don't stop until your time is finished. So it's those kind of instructions, okay? And then for the control group, he told them to write about something innocuous, like a tree or a field, or the shoes they were wearing that day. And he saw an effect in the experimental group that wasn't large, but it was still something that caught his eye. He did see that that group were having better outcomes for scores on an emotional test, or for scores of psychological distress. They were scoring better than those in the control group. But he did notice that a lot of people in the control group ended up writing about something that was traumatic to them. So even though he gave them an innocuous cue, like write about your shoes, write about a tree, they would find themselves writing about, how this tree that they grew up beside was a really important tree, and it just always used to remind them of their grandmother who died last year, and then they might talk about the grandmother. That's just a random example of how they might end up writing expressively with a cue that was supposed to be innocuous. Anyway, he came up with a better control paradigm in future experiments. In his next experiment, he had the control group write about time management, and this control is still the main control that's used today in expressive writing paradigms. Time management is very, very innocuous, emotionally speaking, and people oftentimes have a lot to write about when it comes to time management. But it's typically seen that the beneficial effects of writing cannot be achieved by writing about time management. So it's a good control because people are still engaging in the practice. It functions as what's called a positive control. So they engage in the practice in writing similar to how the experimental group do, but they're not writing expressively. They're writing about something totally unrelated to our emotional worlds. So his next experiment was more successful. He analysed the attendance of the experimental group, so the group that were expressively writing. He analysed the attendance of that group in the local health centre, and he found that they went to the health centre less than the control group. So this would appear that they were maybe coping better with their physical health and their emotional health from engaging in this expressive writing paradigm. And this really kicked off the field. Numerous other researchers became interested and they started to conduct their own research. I'd say in the last 31 years, there's probably been over 1,000 expressive writing studies conducted. Now, hundreds of these have shown no effect, but there is common features of these experiments which show no effect. Typically, they're not giving specific instructions, so they're not saying, you can switch topics for each expressive writing session. They're not saying to write about an extremely important emotional issue. They're not saying to really open up in your writing. They're typically not giving the specific instructions that the successful experiment does. So that seems to be an important feature of expressive writing, to kind of know what you're doing. And that might even come in the form of very specifically being told you can write about whatever you want, but that seems to be important. So many of these studies have found very interesting results. Expressive writing seems to improve people's grades in college. It seems to help people who've been let go from their jobs get back into the workforce and feel better about losing their jobs. It seems to have beneficial effects on things like psychological distress. So if you engage in it, you're likely to score less on, let's say, a questionnaire which measures psychological distress. And there's even been evidence to show that it has beneficial effects on immunity, as measured by inflammatory markers in the blood. So people who engage in expressive writing have lower levels of inflammatory markers in the blood, which is a marker for an improved immunity, as described by those authors who conducted that study. So the effects are widespread and fascinating. Now, the effect size isn't huge, but it is significant. And that just, I think it shows how useful it is as a tool, but that it's not a cure-all. It's not something that's going to sort all your problems out. It may help you and it may get you along that path, but it's not something to replace something like a formal psychological therapy. Sometimes that is the option that's needed, but it can be a great exercise for you to engage in, like maybe going for a run or listening to music or spending time with your friends. And interestingly, just when I mentioned that, one of the expressive writing studies showed an increase in social behaviour, which the participant themselves didn't notice. So the original study, which measured social behaviour, asked for the participants' self-report, and they said, no, I haven't been talking to my friends anymore, I haven't been engaging socially more. But the people conducting the experiment, Pennebaker and colleagues, were kind of thinking, I don't know if we can trust this self-report. Subjectively, what they're telling us is true, but I think they actually might be engaging socially in ways they're not realising. So they had these participants wear what they called an EAR. An EAR is an electronic automatic recording device, something like that. It was a corny way of trying to get the acronym EAR name on the device. And they found that this device was activated much more after the expressive writing paradigm was engaged in, which shows that yes, people are engaging more socially, but their subjective experience is that they're not. So it's possible that if you engage in this paradigm and you don't notice any subjective improvements in your life, well, there could be measurable improvements from an outside perspective, which you're not even realizing, which I find very, very interesting. So if you think that expressive writing is interesting to you, if you think it's helpful, check out the link that I have in the description. It'll provide you with some more descriptions on how to maybe engage in the paradigm. The researcher I mentioned, James W Pennebaker, has a book called Opening Up by Writing It Down, which talks more about the paradigm and will give you a really in-depth look at the approach. And he also has a couple of great talks on YouTube, which I highly recommend you watch if you're interested. He's a great TED talk on how the expressive writing can be analysed, and there's a fascinating bit of trivia that he includes in that, which I can share with you now. He found that upon analysis of different poets, the writing of different poets, that suicidal poets were more self-referential. So they used more phrases like I, me, myself, etc. Whereas non-suicidal poets still wrote about incredibly emotional topics and issues, but they were typically outward looking. So they used less personal pronouns, first person pronouns. So he kind of, with this discovery, he was able to understand how linguistics can be a marker for potential emotional distress or maybe even suicidality. So that the work that he did on that language analysis can be found in another book called The Secret Life of Pronouns. If you wish to read that, I highly recommend it too. But first things first, check out that TED Talk if you're interested, and check out the other Apple lecture he has. I'm going to put all the links in the description. If you have any questions for me about my experience or about my understanding of expressive writing, make sure to ask them in the comments. Make sure to like the video if you liked it, dislike if you didn't, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and follow me on Instagram at Pat Psychology Masters. So I'm sorry the videos aren't coming as regularly as I wished them to be, but I'm going to make a concerted effort to do better now over the Christmas period. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.